Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. Obviously, this can't be a comprehensive data discussion, but I think just like earlier today when you saw some of the classifications, it's always important to understand the anatomy that you're dealing with, because as you'll notice with data and decision making, as the anatomy becomes more complicated, basically all of our therapies become not as good. So here's a case where you've got common iliac occlusion. It's flush occluded, so when you're in these positions, I think you have to think about a lot of things in terms of what French size, what sheath, what access, what wires, what balloons, but ultimately this talks about stents, so we will get to the point where we talk about stents. So bilateral access is always important as well, because you have to maintain the other side. You never know in these occlusions whether you're going to end up with a situation where you have to recreate the aortoiliac bifurcation. So get as much access as you can safely. When you cross these, I think it's very important to understand how you crossed and where you are currently, because that should also influence some of your decision making. So in this particular instance, once things were ballooned open, I went ahead and ran an IVUS catheter so that I could properly size the vessel, and then these are the choices. So, you have to think about whether you're going to treat this as a single vessel or whether you're going to end up having to kiss 2 stents. Your PTA choice in terms of how much vessel prep you have to do. Again, if you IVUS or you do CTA imaging ahead of time, you'll have a very good idea of what sort of plaque morphology you're talking about. And then stent choices are varied, but there's an economic thing. So it's very easy for me to stand up here and just say, well, just use a covered stent 100% of the time, but there's economic implications in that. So I think that, you have to think about all of these things. Ultimately, you're going to do whatever you think is best, but I don't think you need to be pushed one way or the other. So in terms of IVUS in this particular instance, there was some moderate disease in the aorta. There was no involvement up the right side, 10 millimeter diameter, so I chose a balloon expandable bare metal stent. So I wasn't overly fearful of any serious complication, but again, you have to be prepared for those. And this is just a study showing that IVUS, to no one's surprise, also in the iliacs, does have some benefit, and you should not be afraid to use it. So here's the final result on that day. The other side was treated with a bare metal self-expanding stent, so both sides ended up being treated, but not the bifurcation. And why did I bring that up? Because I think it's important to talk about these stent types. Again, it's not going to be exhaustive, but I think we do have good data in terms of iliac stenting, and as you can see, as the complexity of the lesion increases, your results kind of start to fall off a cliff. So task D is a difficult set of people. No matter what you do, at about 1 year, things are going to fall apart, no matter what you choose. But in the other instances, task A, B, and C, you're going to have very good 24-month results with stents in the iliac artery. And then this is an interesting graph, because this takes all of the primary patency in this trial, but then it breaks it down on the right side. And so there is sort of a mythology in the common iliac that I'm not sure still exists, but at one point there was some mythology about self-expanding stents in the iliac and not working, and you need to use balloon expandable and all of this other stuff. And as you can see here, in this particular 24-month follow-up period, self-expanding stents performed the best. So, and I'm not opening that up so we can have an arm wrestling match about it or anything, but I just want to dispel rumors as much as I can. So another good trial was the ICE trial. And again, in this trial, both stent types did okay, but I think it's just interesting to note that the TLR and the restenosis was lower with self-expanding. And the reasons for that are probably varied. Maybe when you use self-expanding, you do a better job of vessel prep, maybe you post-dilate more, who knows. But at the end of the day, ABI improved a lot. There wasn't a difference in amputation or any major adverse event. So both are good. That's the point I was trying to make. When you get into subgroup analysis, such as calcium, that's where maybe the additional force and the additional strength of balloon expandable may be better. In this, you had heavy calcification. It was better. In large vessel diameter, it was a trend. So there may be something to that. And so when you look at the guidelines, what do the guidelines say? Well, there's very strong data for balloon expandable bare metal stents in and around the aorta-iliac bifurcation, but there's decent data for self-expanding stents. I think it's more of a technical issue about confidence of, if you're going to land it, and again, what kind of plaque morphology. As you get into the external iliac artery, I think that's where self-expanding data is very strong. All right, so 10 months later, my beautiful result is not beautiful. And I think there's probably multiple reasons, operator error being number one. But I think what's interesting to note here is the right-sided lesion was the less complicated one, treated with self-expanding, and it looks beautiful. The other side was the complicated one, and it shut down. So, and in this instance, because we didn't have enough time to go over the whole case, this guy has bilateral SFA occlusions with really good collateralization, but I mean really bad disease. So he needs his iliacs, and so when you're re-intervening, you have to have a purpose there because this guy is living off the profundas, and you just saw an elegant presentation demonstrating the importance of that. So re-PTA, and then in this particular instance, balloon expandable covered stent for the restenosis. There's not a ton of data for that, but I think there's enough to make that worthwhile. I think re-stenting it with a bare metal balloon expandable wouldn't have made a lot of sense, and redoing it with a self-expanding maybe would have made even less sense than that. So that was the decision making in this case. So for ISR, you see that covered stents have 2A evidence, so that's better than pretty much anything else we have. So I think that's a reasonable choice when faced with ISR in the iliac. Now, this particular case is a little more complicated because you not only have the occlusion of the left common iliac, but you also have an aneurysm in the external. The internal iliac artery is not doing a lot on the left side. It's intact on the other side, and that will also become important. So in this instance, right radial access, left femoral access, crossed from above. It was going to be impossible to go through that aneurysm and cross from below. So luckily, I got across it, ballooned it, and so now that it's ballooned, you have to make some decisions because this, again, is pretty much flush occluded at the aorta, and there is heavy involvement of the external iliac artery, and it's aneurysmal. So this is where covered stents, again, would come into play. And so what's the data looking at covered stents versus bare metal stents? This is a study looking at self-expanding stents. They were used more in these sorts of lesions where there's combination common and external iliac artery as well as in CTOs. They tended to be used more in lesions that were longer and performed reasonably well. As you see here, when you look at both matched and unmatched covered stents, they both did better in the analysis than their bare metal counterparts. And then more in task D and more successful in heavy calcium. And then from COBEST, you see another example of a comparison between covered stents and bare metal stents, where in task C and D lesions in particular, if you look at this trial overall, there's not really that same benefit in A and B, but in C and D, there is clear benefit for covered stents. So in this particular instance, in the external and extending into the common, but not all the way to the aorta, I chose a balloon expandable covered stent that has a lot of flexibility. So I felt that was a good choice to exclude the aneurysm and treat that segment. As it turned out, in terms of after ballooning and IVUSing, this was a situation where it wasn't going to be able to be a unilateral treatment. So kissing stents were used, and those were balloon expandable bare metal stents. Because of the plaque morphology, there was nothing onerous up near the aorta-iliac bifurcation that made me think we needed covered stents. And then that's the final angiogram. So summary of that case, if you look at it, you've got data for every decision made, good data in the aorta-iliac arena and the external iliac for the stent choices. Again, I think, local politics are local, and you have to analyze what these financial implications are. So if you want to use covered stents all the time, that's great. Your CFO will find you, and maybe you'll be invited to another hospital to perform some of those cases. But so there's data, there's guidelines, and I encourage you to look at it. Again, this was kind of a quick trip through a complicated area, but that's all I have for you. Thank you very much.